On today's Locked On Bucks, we recap the biggest comeback win for the Bucks this season, the New Year's Eve victory in Indianapolis, and take a look ahead at the month of January, a month we're already in now. Comes up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Frank Madden, as we thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter, free and available. If you have not signed up yet, do so at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com to get your day started with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Frank, the Bucks capped off the 2024 calendar year with an impressive win. I don't know if it was their most impressive, the comeback was, but early on in that game, I don't know about you, but it kind of felt like, I know Giannis said he's good to go, but man, he's clearly not still the Giannis that we expect. I would have almost rather just sat him here and given him 2+ weeks off.
Yeah, it was strange, right? Because like very first possession right off the tip, he gets the ball and he sees Pascal Siakam, I think, right in front of him and just blows by him and goes up for a righty layup on the left side and just, biffs the layup. And it was like, it was like, well, the quickness seemed to be there, but just the sharpness at finishing just wasn't. And he missed two more like point blank shots. Like Chris had sort of a little improvised alley-oops that I think he basically kind of, sort of alley-ooped it and somehow rimmed out the alley-oop and then got fouled. And then he blew another layup, when he got really good position a few minutes later. So he starts 0 for 3, 2 points on a couple of free throws in the first quarter. And yeah, it felt like, this is not peak Giannis. And, the fact that they were in the game after one was encouraging because Dame had the offer in the first quarter. And then Dame had the offer in the second quarter, and Giannis gets only, a couple more points. Finally hit a basket in the second quarter. So it felt like they were kind of hanging around, but then, man, whatever, lackadaisical feeling that Giannis might have had or lack of energy he might have had or just lack of sharpness from just not playing. I mean, the whole team was kind of feeling it. And the turnovers, I think they had 10 turnovers in the first half. And I mean, look, sometimes teams, are getting in passing lanes and, forcing turnovers. Like, I mean, just the number of kind of unforced errors the Bucks were making was just so annoying to watch. And, fortunately, the Pacers were not, I would say, playing at their best level either to keep it, within 11 at halftime. Because if you told me Giannis and Dame were going to combine for 1 of 13 shooting and score 4 points in the first half, I would have said, yeah, just burn the videotape. But amazingly, they didn't even come out sharp to start the second half. Yeah. But they figured things out. They went to that zone, which we see them do seemingly every game against the Pacers. When things go bad, they have to go to that zone. And fortunately, in this case, the zone plus Giannis plus Gary Trent and AJ Green and other guys and Dame starting to hit 3-pointers. It all kind of turned the tide really impressively. And maybe not the most impressive one of the season, but one of the more important ones when you consider you coming off 2 pretty, unexpected losses. And really don't want to take a third loss during a part of the schedule when you have an opportunity to win some games.
Yeah, and especially with Bucks killer D'Angelo Russell coming to town tomorrow now with the Brooklyn Nets. You swap out one in Shake Milton and bring in D'Angelo
and Schroeder.
Russell.
Dennis Schroeder's gone.
Yeah,
exactly.
But yeah, and when you got to halftime, I mean, I had this conversation with Dave Kane too during one of the breaks of halftime of, I mean, I guess famous last words, but I actually feel really good only being down 11 here, given those shooting numbers from Giannis and Dame, the turnovers too. I think 7 of those 10 came in the second quarter too. That everything was just trending, and the Bucks were 4 of 20 on threes. That everything screamed Indiana should really be winning this game by like 20+ points. And we both felt like, I think we're going to know in the first 5 minutes of this quarter if this is going to be a blowout that the Pacers win by the margin you would expect with those numbers, what they were, or is this a close game? And the funny part was it felt like we did know in the first 5 minutes of, okay, this is the blowout where the Pacers run past them. And then the Bucks just started to make plays, started to hit shots. The zone that you mentioned, And I mean, it does feel like it's reserved for the Pacers. We've seen it with a few other teams. Doc Rivers, too, has said many times when he talks about the zone, yeah, we go to it in the third quarter. So that way teams can't make adjustments at halftime, which I don't know, Frank. At some point, some team is going to say, well, we know the Bucks can play zone. So let's be ready for this in the third quarter.
Yeah, I don't. It's sort of one of these funny things with NBA teams. I mean, NBA teams have been able to run zones for I don't know, like a couple decades now, basically, right? Since the days of the illegal defense in the '90s went away, or the old illegal defense rules went away. Um, it is just funny though how so often it does throw a team out of its rhythm, and I think the interesting thing is I think last year when the Bucks went to that zone against Indiana, it was so often about getting out of Indiana being able to run the pick and roll with Halliburton and typically Turner, who can obviously pick and pop or pick and roll. And it seems like this year in these two games, I don't really recall that really being much of an issue, right? I mean, Halliburton has not played well in either of these games. Bucks contained him again yesterday. Ajax, I think, put in another good shift, but I mean, even when Ajax wasn't on the floor, they were able to contain Halliburton, which is always fun to see. Hashtag front runner. So yeah, I mean, I think it just again slows them down and makes them have to think a little bit more. And the interesting thing I think the one of the most interesting things about the Pacers, like I think you asked a casual fan last year when you kind of had like peak Pacer offense, just running up and down the floor, dominating, scoring 120 points a night. You asked them like, how good do you think the Pacers are at 3-point shooting? People would have assumed that people said like, oh, they must be a great 3-point shooting, right? To be able to score in this era and put up tons of points, like you must be a good 3-point shooting team. And that really that's not been their MO, is that they're not a team that just chucks lots of threes. And ironically, in this big win that they just had against Boston, the game prior to the Bucks,
I think
Halliburton
8 or 9.
Yeah, Halliburton hit 1 3 and scored 31 points. So, again, they get up and down the floor, which Bucks fans are very familiar with, the Pacers getting up and down the floor and getting fast break baskets. They had 22 fast break points yesterday. They had plus 9 points per 100 added on the transition, which is tremendous if you use the cleaning the glass metrics. So that problem persisted. But in the half court, I think they were 82 points per play. And the offensive rebounding didn't really hurt the Bucks too much either, in terms of the Pacers getting reloads, which can be an issue obviously in a zone. Sometimes it's just harder to put a body on a man box out. So yeah, I mean, I think whatever it was, it just seemed like they did not adjust sufficiently to it. They took a lot of mid-range jumpers. I think they took where it was both teams took 17 mid-range jumpers, which for the Pacers that's like it was like 99th percentile in terms of way too many mid-range jumpers. So yeah, I think the Bucks defense was able to withstand that early 3-point barrage. I think at the point when they were down 19, I think it was when Matherin hit that 3 to make it 19. And I think my memory serves correctly, the Pacers were 9 out of 21 from 3. The Bucks were 4 out of 21.
Yeah.
So pretty cleanly, like that was your game right there, right? Plus 15 on the exact same number of threes, and they were up 19 points. So I mean, you only had at that point a quarter and a half to mean revert and to make up the deficit. But that's what happened from there on out. And Bucks were 8 out of 12 from 3 to close. Gary Trent maybe had the 2 biggest daggers there in that second half late in the game. But you had AJ Green hitting a couple threes. You had Dame going from scoreless to hitting 3 big threes that dragged the Bucks back into it, and his last one gave the Bucks a lead. So yeah, I mean, I think then they cleaned up. Obviously, the game slowed down a little bit. They cleaned up just some of the transition stuff late in the game as well. And lo and behold, you see 112 points that they start, and you think like, oh, that wasn't actually that good of a defensive game. And then you look at again pace adjusted. That was the 7th best defensive rating the Bucks have had all year. It was about 103 points per 100, which is great. So again, that's sort of like the funhouse mirror effect that pace can have on these games, where it feels like they're running up and down the floor, scoring a bunch, but actually they weren't very efficient at all. And the 3-point shooting, I mean, that was an okay 3-point shooting game for them, right? And we've seen them last year. They didn't shoot the ball that well from 3-point range against the Bucks all year, and they still scored at will throughout much of the season series last year. So yeah, Bucks defense obviously have had some bobbles here and there, but kind of that broader narrative that we've talked about in terms of them cleaning some things up, I think, held again yesterday. And, again, like, or just a really important win to kind of just get
Yeah.
back in the winning department, and claw back to, instead of going a game above 500, right, 16-15, you're
Yeah.
kind of in a play-in spot now. You at least feel like you're getting a little bit back to normal, and you're getting, obviously, your team healthy, which, again, knock on wood, like, obviously that's kind of everything.
I think there's a few things to point out too about where they currently reside now at 17-14 and what we're seeing in the East. So I want to get into that coming back. But, speaking of the mid-range too, what we saw from Giannis in this game yesterday. So we'll get into that conversation coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. This episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Rocket RX. If you're ready to boost your confidence and take control in the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Just complete a quick 100% online consultation, and you could get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes 2 minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. One quick note on the 3-point shooting too. It just goes to show you, we gave the numbers of where the Bucks were at halftime, with 20% at 4 of 20 on threes. And it was everyone that was missing too. It just goes to show you how poorly they were shooting in the first half. When you talk about reverting to the mean, that they went 8 of 13 on threes in the second half and still finished with a good number. But it wasn't like, if you have an 8 of 13 half, you expect to be above 40%. And I think they were 37% on threes. So it was a massive struggle. But you mentioned the mid-range and the volume from both of these teams. And again, it's what we continue to see from Giannis. He was technically 5 of 9 on mid-range shots yesterday. One was like a step inside the 3-point line.
That late clock one that he had to just throw up. Yeah.
I'm going to say it was 5 of 8 on mid-range shots yesterday. But the baseline seems to be there with what we've consistently seen from him in his efficiency from that spot. And I think all 5 of those came at the midpoint in the third quarter on.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a post-game talking point on Twitter when Siakam and Giannis started jawing.
Yeah.
After one, you could see it on TV after Giannis hit a mid-ranger, and I think he was down like 15 or something like that.
17 or something.
Yeah, so something like that. It was not close. Which of course is an additional kind of funny kind of subtext of this game, given all of the, Halliburton front runner stuff that we've kind of had in the discourse over the last year and a half. So Giannis trash talking with Siakam down double digits. Nothing to be proud of there if you still up and losing the game. But the fact that he was, engaging in that way, we often say you won't like Giannis when he's angry. And that kind of felt like what happened after that, right? He got a couple buckets early in the third quarter, even as the lead was growing for Indiana. So he was kind of starting to, get back a little bit on track, get a little bit of a feel for the game, and then started hitting those mid-rangers. And you worried a little bit like, okay, is he going to get baited into shooting too many of these now?
Yeah.
Which, it's always a bit of that double-edged sword. If you hit them early, do you then start taking too many of them? Which, I think we've seen. I think maybe one of the Charlotte games that happened where he hit a bunch early, or maybe it was the Celtics game, one of the Celtics home games, he hit a bunch early and then missed a bunch in the second half. You kind of have to obviously just live with it, and he just obviously needs to make good decisions. He had another one where the fadeaway from kind of around the free throw line, which he looked like he got fouled on. There wasn't a call. And then there was the one that he hit baseline where Miles Turner on the replay very clearly pushes his hip as he's going. So Turner was sort of the secondary defender, and Turner just puts his hand on Giannis's hip and just sort of pushes him as he's stepping back. It was clearly a foul as well. Thankfully, he made that turnaround. And then the dagger late when I think they were up 5, I want to say, with under a minute left. He hits that kind of really difficult wing long two that he was given the 2 fingers and the salute on, which I feel like we've seen him do that a fair bit. So shout out to the long two. I guess, is Giannis the only guy that has a long two celebration? Everybody else has 3-point celebrations. Giannis now has a long two celebration. So, but yeah, I mean, he was just as rusty as he looked in the first half. 26 points in the second half, and it's just weird. Like because I was sort of thinking about in the context of, man, is his streak of 24 straight games scoring 20 and above 50%, like this is under threat here, right? Is that all we have to sort of cheer for in the second half with the way that things were going? And then he gets the 4th foul. We should probably mention that too, right? He had 4 fouls right at the start of the third quarter, and in the second quarter he picked up a bad foul in the backcourt that was got him a technical for, well, it wasn't a technical foul, but it was a transition take foul, which of course is like the call that Giannis is basically meant to help Giannis, but here he was committing it against the Pacers. And then he had another foul right after that to give him 3. So he was kind of on the edge there. And obviously Doc Rivers early in the third quarter just decided, like, there's no point saving him. What am I saving him for? This game's kind of almost out of hand anyway. So credit to Doc for just being like, you know what, Giannis, you just keep playing through this. But yeah, it was just really fun to watch him kind of go to work. And we've seen him obviously historically. What he does is just dominate the Pacers inside. In this game, a little bit less of that, although we did see, that especially that one give and go with Chris where he, Ben Matherin had to make a business decision instead of blocking and going up for the block. But yeah, just a great, performance from 13 in the third quarter, 13 in the fourth quarter, and obviously made plays when they needed them to.
You wonder too, how much that shot diet would have been different if this wasn't Giannis's first game back from back spasms and an illness too. As we mentioned, it looked like something was a little off to start the game, but then he really picked it up in the second half with 26 of those points. And I mean, that's Camille and I have talked about, and I think you and I have talked about this too, about the defense. And, the more we're seeing from this group where they're just continuing to, whichever way you slice the data, be right around a top 10 defense, the more you like, okay, I think there's staying power to this. This isn't fool's gold. And it's the same with this shot for Giannis, that we're starting to see it much more consistently now, falling too, but just his overall diet of shots. I mean, we've talked about this a couple of times already this year, but it is a record pace for Giannis in terms of his 3-point attempts. It's 2 or 3% of the shots that he's taken so far this year. And the long mid-range shots, to me, which is what is even more important, because we've always seen Giannis dabble with those. And I know you've talked at times about him trying to figure out the push shot and the baby hook shot, but that seems to kind of have fallen by the wayside. But taking more of those long mid-rangers, I think that shot is more important. And I think it's easy to explain too, when we've heard routinely from Doc Rivers, look, one of the things that we worked with him on, and I know Vin Baker is big in this regard too, is you got to operate out of the elbow. So you're not going to take short mid-range shots if that's where you're setting up. And that gives the defense more chances to kind of collapse on Giannis too. So when he's setting up from there, he's found his comfort zone, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think, I'm looking at Basketball Reference. Again, depending on categorization, like NBA.com has a mid-range category, which kind of aggregates things a bit. And so it depends on sort of how you sort of slice and dice the data. But you're looking at his numbers. Interestingly, his rim finishing is down this year. It's only 75%, which by his standards is low as 82% last year. It's been above 80% 3 of the previous 4 years. But the 3 to 10 area, so basically kind of that like floater area. Last year he was at 45%, which was the best mark of his career. This year he's at 43%. So it doesn't feel like it's been a major part of his diet by any stretch. He's taking fewer of those shots, but he's making them enough to be dangerous, I would say. And it wasn't like, it hasn't been like in previous years. He's a 37% career guy from that range, and had a number of years where he was, in the 30s as well. But then you look 10 to 16 feet, 54.5%. That's like Chris Middleton, those are like Chris Middleton numbers, right? From 10 to 16. And then 16 to 3, 44%. And both the 44% and the 54 probably not shocking, are the best numbers of Giannis's career. So, yeah, I think it's just, having that kind of outlet, that ability has just obviously been important. And look, you could go into a slump and those numbers could come way down. I still think part of me is like a little bit
Waiting
kind of
for
wait and
that.
see. Yeah, I mean, well,
Yeah.
wait and see, right? I mean, because
Yeah.
he's been so good. I mean, it's one thing
Yeah.
to be better than he was, but he's been so good that you obviously can only sort of help but wonder, like,
Yeah.
can he really keep this up? But hey, as long as it continues to work, I think obviously you just sort of happily take it and let him kind of know what he's capable of. And the other piece of this as well, which I think I always want to point this out when people talk about Giannis and being able to mix in that mid ranger. And Giannis has fed the narrative by saying like, oh, he's thinking about his body and he can't always go to the rim, whatever. Giannis is still going to the rim as much as he ever literally ever has. His shots at the rim are 56% of his shots. That's the highest number since the first year of the Bud era, which was like kind of like the peak, run and dunk Giannis. He had 279 dunks that first year that Bud was in town, his MVP season. This year he's on pace to exceed that. And last year he had 251 dunks, which was the second biggest number of his career. So I think that's an interesting sort of aspect of his evolution, is that his share of shots at the rim has gone up. 21-22, the year after the championship, he only took 41% of his shots at the rim. So it's gone up very significantly. It went up to 48%, then 52%, then 56% this year. So again, even with the fact that he's getting older, I mean, I think he admits too, he kind of jokes about it. Like, he's not as like explosive of a leaper. I don't think he's as fast. He's bigger, stronger than he was then, but he has been able to translate that into and his craftiness and his skill level. He's able to sort of get to the basket as much as he ever has. So even by taking more jump shots, and again, not like those jump shots are hyper efficient, right? When you think about they're only worth 2 points, but he can just still get to the rim so relentlessly that the overall efficiency is still fantastic. So I mean, again, like, I don't know what else you can say about the guy other than just just hope he continues to do exactly what he's been doing. Maybe make more free throws, but other than that, it's just he's really found just a really nice balance of those things. And I think with Chris coming back as well, obviously the connection that they have, the chemistry they have, that should also hopefully tick up that at rim field goal percentage a little bit, which again I'm not complaining about, but the connectivity they have and the alley oops and all that, obviously that's only going to help him further as well.
Yeah, and I like Billy Donovan. I think Mark Daignault, a few other coaches have talked about it too. And you mentioned he's still getting to the rim. It's like the way he contorts his body and he finds angles that don't exist. That was a huge talking point from Daignault last year. Every time we heard from him, of this guy just sees the smallest gap and he gets to the rim. It's not just the run and dunk guy, but yeah, when you look at the field goal attempts are up, those are coming from not taking threes, that he's getting to the rim more and he's taking more mid-range shots. I mentioned the what we saw yesterday from the bench. We've talked about this a couple of times. It was very interesting to see how things are kind of starting to fall into place now. And Doc Rivers had some interesting comments about it after the game. So I want to take a look at the second unit and what we've seen from them of late, and also take a peek at another interesting month for the Bucks in January, when you have an even split of home and road games. But on paper, it's actually a favorable schedule. We'll dig into that next. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Rocket Money. It can help you find any subscriptions you may have forgot that you were paying for in any of your subscription services. It's a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it is subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on today. That is rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Rocketmoney.com/locked-on. So the bench, Frank, Gary Trent Jr., another big game with 14 points. You mentioned those two huge threes that gave them I think a 4 and 5 point lead. And that second one essentially felt like the knockout punch. But we've just kind of seen this bench, I think, fall into place and find their roles. I would assume you have similar feelings. I personally hate plus minus, and when you point to the plus minus as like, see, this player was good. I do think there is some value with it to to bench players. But still, it hinges on who's on the floor with you. But every single player, save for Ryan Rollins yesterday, who just played like 90 seconds to spell Giannis from the bench, had a positive plus minus. And I think that matches the eye test and what we saw not only yesterday, but with this group as a whole. And Doc Rivers talked about it after the game too and said, look, we are a deep team. And I think the asterisk there is I don't disagree, but I think the quality of depth is certainly a different discussion to have with other teams out there. But the big difference from this year to last year is last year you played who you played because you had no other options. This year you at least have options. We can debate how good they are on a scale of the Bucks versus the Celtics and Cavs and other teams, but you at least have other options. And Doc's point was, look, we're not playing Pat Connaughton. We're not playing DeLon Wright when we're healthy. AJ Green and Gary Trent Jr. are basically splitting minutes that a typical reserve would expect to see. So I think we're a deep team now.
It's
and
kind
you
of funny.
disagree.
No, well, I was gonna say it's so weird. I was looking at the plus minus metrics for the season, and it is very, very different from last year. And if I had told you before the season that the Bucks without Giannis and Dame on the floor this year would be +4 points per 100 in 465 possessions, you would have said, "Oh my God,
Who did they
are the
trade
Bucks?"
for?
Well, or you would just say like, "Are the Bucks like the juggernauts of the East suddenly?"
Right,
Oh, man, that's really good. The flip side, if I didn't tell you that, but I instead told you that the Bucks are, I think, -1 points per 100 with Giannis and Dame together. I think they're -2 point something with Giannis and no Dame, and with interesting with Giannis and no Dame, or with Dame and no Giannis,
With
they're
Dame and
slightly
no
negative,
Giannis.
but with
Yeah.
Giannis and no Dame, I think they're +3 point something. But if I had told you that they would be scoreboard wise, right? From a descriptive perspective, I'm not assigning blame or saying like, oh, this means that Giannis and Dame can't play together, whatever. But just like what's happened on the floor when Giannis and Dame, your two best players who have been just monsters offensively all season, maybe excepting Dame for the first half yesterday, you would be a negative team. You would be like, this is a disaster. How can they ever recover from this? But I think it does speak to, they found obviously guys and a combination off the bench. They've settled into this 9-man rotation. We talked about, Ryan Rollins has played well, but he's the 10th guy. So fittingly, when he did get in yesterday, it was just barely. I thought it was interesting. He came in to a game where the Pacers had been, Pacers obviously pressure the ball. TJ McConnell, Exhibit A, he created another couple turnovers off of inbounds yesterday. I thought, man, that's not Ryan Rollins' strength. I was a little nervous when he comes in to start the fourth, like cold. And I was like, are they going to ask him to like bring the ball up against the Pacers pressure? That doesn't seem like a great recipe. But they had Chris ball handling a lot. Like they didn't obviously kind of put it all on him. So I don't know entirely what to make of it. I think, part of what I see I was thinking about Gary Trent the other day because it felt like he's had a number of these games where he just comes in and just starts bombing threes. And when he does that off the bench, and he did it, I mean, he had a couple of them, I think one or two of them, I want to say in the first half. And then he had obviously the couple of really big ones late that were really, those are difficult threes. Those are not like, wide open threes. When he does that,
I think he hit their first 3 of the game, like midway, late in the first or midway in the second quarter.
It was a corner 3 off a Giannis pass. It was not an easy look. And it's a bit interesting because I feel like watching Gary Trent this year, I mean, superficially, like it's obviously, I'm sure Gary's disappointed that, he wasn't able to keep the starting spot. He's averaging, his lowest points per game in I don't know how many years, right? He's at like 9 point something. His efficiency is up. He's at 56, 57% true shooting. His 3-point shooting has gotten to a very good number. I think he's right around 40%. But yeah, it is a bit weird because it kind of feels like this is essentially what we would have seen last year if they had just let Malik Beasley coming off the bench instead of basically putting him as a starter for the first, 78 games or whatever it was last year. So I think it's just, I mean, when I see Gary Trent come in, I feel good. When I see AJ Green come in, I feel good, and I feel confident that those guys are going to make shots and, give you a bit of a boost offensively. which is something that, I think there have been a lot of moments these last few years where when the bench guys come in, you kind of start to feel like, oh man, can the offense like continue to score points? And weirdly enough, this year that just hasn't been a problem. And obviously, like putting Ajax in the starting five, like completely sort of shifts the dynamic of your other guys and sort of the offensive versus defensive balance. And so I don't know. I still don't know entirely what to make of the Bucks offense. I mean, when Giannis and Dame are on the floor together, which is a lot of possession so far, they have 113 offensive rating. Like that's like slightly
Not
below
good.
average.
Yeah.
And those guys have scored efficiently, and the team has shot efficiently from three. So it's like what kind of what's going wrong? Obviously, offensive rebounding has been non-existent with that group, and they just sort of haven't done enough stuff on the margins. But again, after a win, let's call it glass half full. We know that Giannis and Dame together should be able to score.
Yeah.
Like the offense overall should be able to score efficiently, especially when those guys are playing the way they are. But for some reason, like it's still something like hasn't entirely clicked there. So hopefully, again, it's like I'm not going to sit here and tell you that like the defense is carrying the Bucks or something right now. But if we're talking again about overachievement, pleasant surprises versus areas that can still improve, I mean, the offense still feels like basically ever since Doc arrived, which is weird because it's not like Adrian Griffin had any sort of offensive, coaching pedigree. And his offensive coach walked out the door on him in training camp in Terry Stotts. So I don't know. It just felt like they sort of just, by virtue of maybe just not even trying on defense, they were able to score a ton offensively last year. But it still feels like the offense has really not clicked to the degree that it can, even though the shooting has started to come around, and even though we've seen Brook, who again didn't figure in the comeback really. They went away from Brook, but Brook was really important. He was one of the few guys that was scoring when everybody else was having problems. So you've seen, I think, Brook, Bobby, and obviously Chris coming back. Those guys begin to provide scoring from the others' positions, but we still haven't seen that offense click in a way that I think it'll need to for this team to get above this sort of play-in fray, where they've been sort of trending.
It's interesting too, because Gary Trent Jr.'s numbers, you mentioned the lowest scoring output it's been in quite some time. It's his lowest per game average since his second year in the league. And that's basically where a lot of these numbers kind of fall, like his minutes, the fewest he's played since that year as well. But I mean, for the way he started, he's shooting 41% on threes. And I know we talked about it over the summer too. Malik Beasley is a better shooter than Gary Trent. But when you think about the players on the floor and the looks he's going to get, similar to what Beasley got last year, like, can he be a 41% three-point shooter? Because Bees was 42% last year. It's early. We're only a third of the way through the season-ish, but right now that's where he's currently sitting. And the other interesting thing about the lineups, just to close that point, as you were saying that, like I've looked at those offensive numbers with Giannis and Dame quite a bit and just thought, well, I wonder, I mean, granted, it's not going to make up a ton of those possessions, but it has to be a different story when Ajax is off the floor and those two are on. It's worse. They're a point per 100 possessions worse in the minutes where Giannis and Dame are on the floor together and Andre Jackson Jr. is not there. So look, it's not the best bench in the league, but the roster overall makes sense. And it applies to the second unit where they kind of fill the gaps. Now, I still think the thing that you would point to is what you're missing is a ball handler and a facilitator, because that's not DeLon Wright's strengths. You talked about Ryan Rollins. Doc has said this too. Like, Ryan is not a point guard. We are teaching him to be a point guard, but that's going to be a work in progress. So that still kind of feels like the one thing out there of, you can make some type of move. What would it be? To me, it would be that. As we get into January now, the Bucks' schedule is split, home and road, and even split here. They don't play a team with a winning record until 1 week from today, when Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs come to town. But by the numbers, it's interesting because John Schulman puts together his looks every month at, here are teams' schedules and here's what stands out. You knew there was a pocket of games that were more difficult in January. And look, for all of the Bucks schedule stuff that we've referenced before, it's still very favorable because you're in the Eastern Conference, and those are the winning percentages of the teams in your conference. The big thing to keep an eye on is if Philadelphia starts to win more games, that's going to sway your your opponent win percentage in your remaining games. But by the numbers, this really surprised me. They have the easiest schedule in terms of opponent win percentage in the month of January.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to get too excited because you still got to go out and win the games. And when going into the Nets and Chicago games, I just remember there was a lot of talk on the timeline, like, oh, look at the next 7 games.
Yeah, they're going to go on an 8-game win
They could go 7-0, right? And
Yeah.
they'd already won the prior couple games. And then you lose the first 2, right? And you go into Indy and you were staring at the possibility of starting 0-3 of the stretch that you were hoping to go 7-0. So again, I don't know that you can, especially, and obviously a very important caveat on Giannis missing those 2 losses. Obviously Dame coming back in the Chicago game, and again, like, just night to night, you just don't, it's hard to predict, right? Like, stuff happens in the NBA. It's a really long season. That's, I think, been my kind of persistent drumbeat all year, from when the struggles happened to now. Like, the season is very long.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, you are getting closer to the midway point of the season. And, again, notwithstanding the latest bout of injuries post Vegas, where you're missing, your 2 best players for a big chunk of those first few games. Now you just, fingers crossed that, like, if you get injuries, it's not to those critical guys, and that, you can actually get some continuity with the guys that matter. We should mention Chris Middleton, who had moved into the starting lineup with Giannis and Dame out, continued to start yesterday for the first time with those guys, which is, obviously an important milestone. Doc mentioned after the game that Chris, during the game in the fourth quarter, said, I can keep going. You can put me in. I'm
He was a little more crass than that, but
yeah, don't, like, he was not, minutes limit effort, right? He wanted to go back in. He did come back in, and they closed with that group. So I think that's obviously, if you're talking about, like, how do you kind of juice the offense? Well, Giannis, Chris, and Dame, like, that's a pretty good place to start in terms of putting those guys all together on the floor, increasing Chris's minutes load, and just getting him out there for, hopefully high 20s, closer to 30 minutes on many nights. So we'll see. I don't think he's not full go. Like, I think they're still gonna, I think, monitor that kind of game to game. But yeah, I mean, obviously Chris has been offensively, has been pretty consistent, not like blowing anybody away. We've still seen kind of, some bad turnovers in the Chicago game, and obviously had a big shot late that he didn't make in that game. But again, like, there's a difference between Chris being out there having to facilitate and, be like the first option or the second option, versus when he's out there with Dame and Giannis, and he's able to be more of that complementary piece, and the other team can't focus on him in the way that they could in those other couple games. But, I mean, he's had this string, right? He scored 18, 21, 21, I think 21 and 15 now yesterday, 7 assists yesterday as well. So he continues to, I think, find ways to impact the game. He's got the best, on-off number on the team. So for whatever rust that he's been going through, especially on defense, I think obviously he's kind of hip checking guys and, probably taking more fouls than certainly you hope that he'll be doing in a few months from now. And hopefully he'll kind of be better laterally and physically feel better than he does right now, when he's still sort of getting his legs under him. But yeah, just nice to see that group being able to get minutes together. And I think as well, I mean, this to me is one of the biggest questions for me. I think that group needs to score a lot, because, I mean, they should. We saw it last year, right? There's no reason that team, that trio with whoever else is out there, even if it's Ajax, shouldn't score a ton of points. But I think the other question is going to be, can they defend at a high enough level, right? I think overall as a team, they have enough guys that they stick out there who can defend, when you include Ajax, and AJ and Torian Prince. And, again, you're really not playing bad defenders, other than Dame, and certainly this version of Chris, is limited. And then, of course, Bobby. So I think probably the biggest question to me is, can you defend at a high enough level with Giannis, Dame, Chris together, given Chris and Dame each have their obvious limitations. And again, maybe they end up having to play more zone than they otherwise would want to. So the third quarter zone maybe becomes more of a theme than we would want it to. I don't think Doc's necessarily going to go to that if they're up, 10 points in the middle of the third quarter. But if the other team goes on a run, maybe they will. So yeah, hopefully with this kind of string of games coming up, hopefully they can just kind of outclass teams. But, we've been talking about it for a while. I think there's still this like winning is the most important thing.
No.
But at some point, if you want to take this team seriously as a team that can make noise in the playoffs or actually challenge for a trip to the conference finals or whatever,
Yeah.
you're gonna
optics.
have to you're gonna have to start like playing at a consistently higher level
Yeah.
because this was the problem last year. This is why Adrian Griffin got
Yeah.
fired. And I think this year, like the vibes have been better that like nobody's talking about it in those sort of distressed terms. But on some level, it's like, well, guys, like at some point you gotta be better than this, right? You know, like
Yeah.
17-14, like given where you started, okay, like it's better. You got the NBA Cup, that was encouraging, but you know, like you're not trending to winning more games than you did last year, which was which was not a banner year by any stretch.
Two things to mention as we wrap here, and in regards to the offense too. I don't think the series is out yet, but I know the next Behind the Bucks series that they do on Bucks Plus is centered on Damian Lillard. And talking with the group that put it together, he does open up and is pretty candid about when Terry Stotts left the Bucks and what that changed for him and everything that he was experiencing and dealing with. So I'm curious to hear that. And then the last piece on the schedule, I point out what they have in January because there's an opportunity right now that we've seen in the Eastern Conference. And I know I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it seems like everybody for the last 2 weeks has basically been 500 except for the Cavs, the Knicks, and the 76ers. So there's a chance to emerge and enter that chat and get in the conversation as one of the top 3 to 4 teams and start to separate yourselves from those groups that are around you right now in the standings, because January is going to be very important, Frank. Once we flip to February, the Bucks have 35 games left. 32 of those 35 are against teams that expect to be playoff teams. Like the Suns are currently not in the mix. The Suns expect to be a playoff team. So it's like, hey, pick up your wins now, beat the teams you're supposed to beat because you're going to be tested from February on. So this is really your last shot to look at the importance of strength of schedule and the home road splits. It's going to make for an important month here.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like it just felt like that we have not seen. We've seen kind of at this point, like the really, really good version of the Bucks. I feel like we've seen it in a handful of games,
a couple of times.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
But I feel like, you know, they have been very mediocre against good teams. They've been in games against good teams, but they're 0-6.
They're not winning. Yeah.
They're 0-6.
It's like the Packers discussion with the team. Like who have the Packers lost to? All the teams are going to have to beat to get to the Super Bowl.
Exactly. And credit the Packers. They've beaten everybody else.
Yeah.
Bucks have not had that same benefit. They've obviously lost to a number of lesser teams, but you're now 0-7 if you include the Knicks in that kind of grouping of the top 3 teams that you're going to have to go through in the East. And unfortunately, you didn't get a bunch of Piston or Sixers games early in the season while they were struggling. Now, we'll see. Their health is obviously always sort of TBD, but they're finally figuring some things out. You're only a few games up on them in the standings as well for all the kind of trouble that they had early in the season. So, yeah, just they kind of just need to kind of grab it by the horns. And I worry a little bit. I mean, I'll say this: the last week or so, it just made me more happy that the Bucks won the NBA Cup because I was happy that they won something this year. Because I don't have high hopes of a championship. I mean, like the odds are against any individual team winning a championship, right? Especially if you're a team like the Bucks, who you'd have to go through. But I worry a little bit. Like Giannis has made comments about like the importance of like they know where they are and like health is important. And I worry a little bit. Like I don't think this team can afford to be complacent about where they are and just be kind of satisfied. Like, we'll be a little above 500 and like, if we're the 6th seed, like that's fine. Like we can, win on the road. It's like, guys, like you have to actually figure out how to play with each other and get to a high level. Even if you make some choices and rest guys, blah, 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 like you got to at least show us beyond like the Thunder game in the NBA Cup final that you guys can hit these high highs. Because at this point, like it's still very theoretical with this team, right? And they have won a lot of games over the past, 6 weeks or so. The defense has been better, but in terms of like being, playing at a super high level with any sort of degree of consistency, like we're still waiting for that. Individually, yes, Giannis, of course, and we're seeing encouraging signs from a number of guys, but like collectively as a group, and I include the coaching staff, like you guys got to figure out, especially offensively, how do you kind of knit all these pieces together
Yeah.
so that you can go out and like win a bunch of like games by 30 points, right? Like, remember that Pistons game? That was fun when you blew out the Pistons on the road. That was fun. Unfortunately, then you turn around the next night, you lost to Atlanta by double digits. So just figuring out like how do you just kind of raise that kind of collective baseline. That's obviously really important right now. And again, time is now because you can't count on making up those games later in the season for the reasons you mentioned.
Yeah, just start to beat good teams. I don't think we're asking for much here when we ask for that for the Bucks. That'll do it for today's show. We will have a post-game show from the Bucks and the Nets. The return once again of D'Angelo Russell. We'll see if it's a D'Angelo Russell game. I think we'll put something up there. Yeah, I think we'll put something up there to preview the game as well. But that'll do it for today's show. For Frank, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you guys once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.